Before most of Europe had even stirred from sleep, something strange was already unfolding under cover of darkness. On the frost-covered highways stretching from Poland into Ukraine, dozens of massive trucks emerged like ghosts. No flags, no fanfare, no media coverage. Just a stream of silent giants moving with a purpose, and at a speed never before recorded by Russian surveillance. To the untrained eye, it looked like another military convoy, but to the Kremlin's intelligence analysts, it was a nightmare dressed in camouflage. These weren't tanks. They weren't missile launchers. They were something even more dangerous. A new kind of movement. A new kind of war. From Lviv to Zaporizhia, Ukraine's roads began to pulse with a rhythm Russia didn't recognize. Quick, fluid, and unpredictable. In real time, encrypted Russian reports from the Donetsk region were rerouted. Defense systems were activated. Field commanders were placed on alert. And yet, no shots had been fired. No explosions. Just movement. Fast, efficient, and terrifying. It wasn't the volume of these trucks that triggered alarms in Moscow. It was the fact that they could move M1 Abrams tanks hundreds of miles in hours, not days. Not with the slow groan of a railway car. These monsters didn't need tracks. They needed only one thing: open space. And suddenly, all of Ukraine became open terrain. That's when the question changed. This wasn't about another round of military aid. It was something bigger. Was this the beginning of a battlefield revolution, where speed, not firepower, becomes the decisive weapon? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the game-changing arrival of America's enhanced heavy equipment transporters, EHADs, and the silent shift they've triggered across Europe's most dangerous front. And if you appreciate this level of reporting, if you believe in stories that go beyond the headlines and into the heart of modern warfare, consider supporting us with a quick thanks below. It keeps us sharp, it keeps us fast, and it keeps us bringing you the truth others are too slow to see. It began without warning. No announcements, no speeches, no leaks to Western media, just movement. On an icy morning near the Ukrainian border, a formation of US-made military trucks crossed into the war zone. But these weren't ordinary supply vehicles. These were EHADs. Enhanced heavy equipment transporters, the kind of hardware that doesn't just move tanks, it moves fear. Within hours, more than 100 of these beasts had fanned out across key Ukrainian supply routes. They traveled in tight tactical formations. No military insignia, no flags, just speed, coordination, and silence. For the first time in months, Russia's frontline intelligence units weren't watching a buildup. They were watching a breakthrough. At first, Russian commanders assumed it was a minor escalation, perhaps new aid shipments or spare parts. But as their satellites and drones zoomed in, they saw something that shattered that illusion. The convoys weren't hauling fuel, food, or ammunition. They were built to carry Abrams tanks, dozens at a time, over mud, snow, wreckage. Anything. And they weren't just moving to the front. They were moving around it, fast, precise, and unpredictable. Inside Russian command bunkers, this realization set off a chain reaction. In Donbass, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk, encrypted orders were sent to fortify roads, reposition anti-tank weapons, and ready fallback positions. Moscow's entire southern defense network was put on edge, not because of what had arrived, but because of how quickly it could arrive anywhere. It was the birth of a new battlefield reality. Ukraine could now strike before Russia could even react. Historically, Russia had relied on one core advantage: time. Its forces moved slowly, but methodically. They dug trenches, built fortified positions, and waited for the enemy to approach. But now, time had turned against them. EHAD stripped Russia of the one thing its entire strategy was built on: predictability. Where tanks once took days to reach critical positions, they could now arrive in mere hours. And that single shift collapsed Russia's entire planning cycle. Supply chains, drone surveillance windows, artillery schedules. None of it mattered if the target had already moved by the time the order was given. That's why this wasn't just another shipment of equipment. It was a strategic earthquake. For the first time since the war began, Ukraine held the initiative, not with firepower, but with logistical dominance. And the Kremlin knew it. What they feared wasn't a wave of tanks crashing through the front. It was the idea that a dozen Abrams could appear anywhere, at any moment, without a whisper of warning. That fear began to paralyze Russian decision-making. The question was no longer if Ukraine would strike. It was when. where, and how fast. And as the first convoys disappeared into the heart of Ukraine, one thing became clear. The era of slow war was over. While most analysts were focused on the battlefield, Washington played a different game. The deployment of EHADs wasn't just military strategy. It was political theater at 80 feet per unit. Each convoy wasn't just hauling metal and treads. It was hauling a message. And that message was aimed at three audiences: allies, enemies, and critics back home. At the heart of it all was a growing divide inside the United States. Pro-Trump lawmakers, echoing isolationist sentiments, had begun to question the billions spent on Ukraine. Why are we funding a foreign war, they asked, while American cities struggle? The Biden administration didn't respond with press conferences. It responded with convoys. The EHADs weren't quietly slipped into Ukraine under media silence. They were delivered with precision and scale, large enough to be picked up by Russian satellites and broadcast across European defense circles. This wasn't aid, this was optics. Each vehicle, stretching nearly 80 feet long, became a rolling billboard of American commitment. Not a promise, not a speech, not a headline, something tangible, something real. To NATO allies growing jittery over prolonged conflict, the message was crystal clear. America isn't stepping back, it's stepping harder. While European capitals debated funding and equipment shortages, Washington was delivering action. And not just tanks, but the systems that could make tanks matter. Mobility, reliability, readiness. It was a quiet flex, and the world noticed. For Russia, it was a nightmare in two parts. First, the realization that Ukraine's mobility just got supercharged. But second, and perhaps more important, was the signal that the West's will had not fractured. In fact, it had evolved. EHADs were proof that U.S. support wasn't fading. It was adapting, leaner, smarter, faster. And for Kremlin propagandists who had pushed the narrative of Western fatigue, this created a dilemma. How do you convince your citizens that NATO is falling apart when 100-plus U.S. military transports just rolled into a war zone overnight? But there was one more layer to this move, one often missed by mainstream commentary. EHADs weren't just about what they carried. They were about how they were seen. In an era where perception drives policy, these massive machines became symbols. For Ukrainians, they represented trust. For Russians, they represented escalation. And for Washington insiders, they represented a strategic middle finger to anyone who doubted America's staying power. Because when words start to fail, movement becomes the loudest message. And nothing moves louder or faster than EHADs. For most of the war, Ukraine fought with one hand tied behind its back, bound to railroads. Every tank deployment, every artillery repositioning, every armor rotation depended on a vulnerable, outdated network of tracks. Those rails were slow, loud, predictable, and most importantly, they were visible to the enemy. Russia knew this. That's why its drones hovered near junctions, why its missiles targeted switching yards and fuel depots. Because for every destroyed rail segment, Ukraine lost time, hours, sometimes days, waiting for engineers to patch the line before they could send in the next wave of armor. In a war where timing is life and delay means death, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was lethal. Then came the EHADs. And suddenly, that entire equation collapsed. With one move, Ukraine decoupled from its railway coffin. These American-built monsters, pairing the M13,000 tractor with M1302 semi-trailers, could haul 70-ton Abrams tanks across nearly any terrain. No tracks required, no stops, no permission, just pure forward momentum. Now, instead of plotting tank movements based on where the tracks led, Ukraine could choose the battlefield. Forests, farmland, frozen roads. It didn't matter. If a back road led to a strategic ridge, they'd take it. If a dried-out riverbed created a shortcut, they'd roll through it. Flexibility became a weapon. And with that flexibility came unpredictability. Russian forces, used to reading rail schedules like a map of the future, suddenly found themselves blind. Where would Ukraine strike next? Where would the tanks appear? Could a quiet village in Kherson turn into an armor staging zone overnight? The answer was yes. And that alone shifted the psychological balance. Imagine you're a Russian soldier on a calm stretch of front. You've heard nothing for days. Your commanders say the sector's cold. Then, suddenly, before sunrise, you hear the roar. By the time you scramble to your trench, You're staring down the barrel of a tank that wasn't supposed to be there until next week. That's not just warfare, that's psychological shock. This is the power of EHADs. Not just faster logistics, but mobility that breaks the enemy's mental map, a force that refuses to stay still, that never gives advance warning, that doesn't wait for the right time, because it creates the right time. Ukraine can now move units from Poland to Donetsk in under a day. No more bottlenecks. No more asking NATO for rail access or airlift timing. Just fuel up and go. It's the kind of autonomy that turns strategy into fluid art, unreadable, unstoppable, and always one step ahead. And when the enemy can't predict you, they can't prepare for you, which means their entire defense becomes a guess. And war, at that point, becomes a game they've already lost. Speed by itself doesn't win wars. It has to be weaponized, turned into strategy. And that's exactly what Ukraine is doing. With the EHADs in play, battlefield movement is no longer a logistical exercise. It's a tactical decision. Ukrainian commanders no longer plan operations around delivery timelines. They plan operations because of them. Need to reinforce a crumbling front in Zaporizhzhia? Send the order. Within hours, M1 Abrams are rolling in. No warning, no rail schedule to hack, just steel in motion. Need to exploit a sudden breach near Bakhmut before Russian drones even process the shift? The haulers are already halfway there. This isn't theoretical, it's happening now. EHADs have turned Ukraine's army into a mobile force capable of shock and strike tactics, once reserved for NATO powers. Before, any major counterattack needed weeks of prep, staging, and risk. Now, it needs a few hours and the right road. That kind of responsiveness reshapes the entire battlefield rhythm. Russian artillery crews used to operate on predictable cycles: set up, fire, reposition, reload. But now they find themselves lobbing shells at coordinates where Ukrainian armor was, not where it is. And by the time Russia recalibrates, the tanks are already hitting the next sector. This is the birth of what analysts are calling fluid warfare, a combat style where flexibility outmatches firepower and where the side that moves fastest forces the other to defend slower. The psychological pressure is massive. Imagine being a Russian brigade deployed to what your generals called a stable front. You've dug in, set up defenses, calibrated mortars. You're ready to hold ground. Then, out of nowhere, a dozen tanks materialize on your flank. No warning. No chatter, just dust and metal. By the time you radio command, the position is already breached. You weren't beaten by numbers. You were beaten by speed. And speed, in this new era of war, is brutal. It doesn't give you time to retreat. It doesn't give you time to regroup. It just keeps moving. Ukraine is now deploying armor in shock bursts, quick, unpredictable attacks launched from unexpected angles. And the EHADs make this possible, because without the ability to move heavy firepower silently and swiftly, these maneuvers would be suicide. With EHADs, they're a checkmate move. And here's the beauty of it: Russia can't match it. Their army relies on long, exposed convoys, on fixed supply lines, on doctrine that assumes the enemy takes days to act. But Ukraine now moves in hours. That advantage doesn't just create opportunity, it creates chaos for the enemy. Each time Ukraine responds faster than expected or attacks from a new axis before Russian scouts can report movement, it throws the Kremlin's entire battle map into question. That uncertainty spreads like a virus, through troops, through command centers, through propaganda channels. It becomes harder and harder to say where Ukraine will strike next. And when a war becomes a guessing game, the side that moves faster usually wins. The moment EHADs rolled into Ukraine, it wasn't just the front line that felt it. It hit the Kremlin like a thunderclap. What was first brushed off as a technical upgrade quickly became a strategic emergency. Moscow's top brass realized, almost too late, that this wasn't about equipment. It was about tempo, and Russia was about to lose control of it. Alarms were triggered inside military command posts across Donbass, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia. Russian intelligence operatives, many of whom were still monitoring Ukrainian railways, suddenly found themselves staring at empty tracks and late reports. Convoys weren't where they should be. Armor was appearing faster than anticipated. The playbook no longer applied. Within hours, the Kremlin ordered an emergency reshuffle of its entire southern defense posture. Trenches were dug deeper. Minefields were expanded along major roads. Bridges were fortified, and some rigged for demolition. Anti-tank weapons were moved closer to the front, often rushed into position without proper cover. This wasn't strategic. It was reactionary, and it showed. Russia, once feared for its calculated, slow-grinding war machine, was suddenly on the back foot. Because, with every passing hour, Ukraine's ability to move tanks without warning was growing, and Moscow had no answer for it. And that's when something even more dangerous happened. The fear spread upwards. Inside the walls of the Kremlin, high-level briefings took on a new tone, no longer about confidence, now about containment. Russian generals voiced real concerns that Ukraine's new mobility could outpace their own ability to defend fixed positions. Some whispered the unthinkable. If Ukraine hits hard, hits fast, and hits simultaneously across multiple fronts, they might not be able to hold the line. This wasn't idle paranoia. It was based on battlefield precedent. Russia had seen this kind of warfare before, from NATO campaigns in Iraq and the Balkans. Mechanized speed paired with shock attacks had collapsed entire regimes in a matter of weeks. And now, thanks to the US, Ukraine had inherited the same tools. Russian state media began shifting its narrative. Gone were the boasts of total control. In their place came cautious warnings about foreign provocations and accelerated Western intervention. The propaganda machine was retooling in real time, preparing the Russian public for potential setbacks. Because the truth was leaking out, not through officials, but through patterns. Satellite images showed frantic trench work in Zaporizhia, new artillery placements near Donetsk, convoys of reserves moving toward frontline choke points. Russia was bracing, not for a major NATO escalation, but for a Ukrainian counterattack that could come from anywhere, at any time, with zero advance notice. But the most devastating change wasn't tactical, it was psychological. Once a war becomes unpredictable, commanders start hesitating, soldiers start second-guessing, generals start fortifying everything, even when they're not sure what they're protecting. Ukraine hadn't fired a single extra missile, but Russia was already feeling the heat. Not from fire, from speed. And in modern war, that's enough to break you from the inside out. Wars aren't just won by bullets and bombs. They're won by logistics, the silent machinery behind every successful strike. And for most of the conflict, that's where Ukraine struggled. While Russian forces had their weaknesses, Ukraine's reliance on vulnerable rail networks made them predictable and slow. Every armored deployment required detailed planning, exposed transit routes, and, most dangerously, time. Russia knew this, and they exploited it relentlessly. Drones hovered over junctions. Missiles struck supply depots and fuel tanks. One blown-up railway bridge could freeze an entire brigade for days. It turned Ukraine's war effort into a reactive game, constantly racing to fix what had been broken. But the arrival of EHADs, that changed everything. These weren't just haulers. They were freedom machines, detaching Ukraine's military from a fragile system and replacing it with one that was agile, self-sustaining, and nearly impossible to intercept. Each EHAD's convoy operates like a moving fortress. They carry not just tanks, but also the infrastructure to keep those tanks moving. Mobile fuel depots, field repair teams, encrypted comm stations. Every unit that leaves a NATO base is a complete system, ready to deploy firepower anywhere on Ukrainian soil without needing permission from a rail schedule. And, perhaps most critically, they move fast. From Poland to Donetsk, an Abrams tank can now arrive in a combat zone in hours, not days. No more bottlenecks. No more asking NATO for airlift approvals or waiting for weather to clear over rail lines. If the direct route is bombed, EHADS finds another. If a bridge is destroyed, they reroute. The war no longer waits on the tracks. It moves on demand. That's why Ukrainian commanders are no longer reacting to Russian moves. They're anticipating them, because logistics, once their biggest liability, is now their greatest strength. Behind every successful strike is a chain of perfectly timed decisions. Route planning, fuel logistics, threat modeling. Thanks to NATO-provided battlefield software, Ukraine now simulates these movements in real time. Where once an ambush would stall a convoy, now the system reroutes on the fly. Where once a broken truck meant a stalled operation, now it's repaired in minutes by onboard techs. Russia, in contrast, still runs on long, exposed supply lines. Convoys stretch across open terrain, vulnerable to drones, HIMARS, and sabotage. Every attack on those lines costs Russia time and morale. But Ukraine, it compresses its timeline down to hours, delivering tanks where they're least expected, at speeds Russia can't counter. This shift has been so effective, Ukrainian logistics teams now operate independently, without relying on U.S. advisors. That autonomy changes the dynamic entirely. Ukraine doesn't just move faster, it moves smarter. EHADs have transformed logistics into a combat weapon, and like any good weapon, it's not just about how powerful it is. It's about who knows how to use it. Right now, Ukraine knows. And Russia is still trying to catch up. What rolled into Ukraine wasn't just a convoy. It was a message on wheels. And it wasn't aimed only at Russia. It was aimed at everyone watching. NATO allies, global partners, skeptical American voters, and even undecided politicians. Because EHADs weren't just about changing how Ukraine fought. They were about redefining who leads when it counts. In the quiet corridors of Brussels and Berlin, there's been growing anxiety. Would the U.S. keep backing Ukraine? Would Washington's internal politics derail long-term support? Would NATO fracture under pressure? EHADs answered all of that without a single word. While European governments argued over budgets and future shipments, the U.S. moved fast, not just delivering tanks, but delivering the power to move tanks independently. Before Germany could finalize Leopard supply chains, or France could coordinate armored deliveries, America had already laid new ground routes. It wasn't just logistics, it was a strategic flex. And it came with a warning. Though unspoken, the meaning was clear. We're still the ones driving this alliance. For NATO, this was both comforting and challenging. On one hand, U.S. leadership offered stability in a chaotic war. On the other, it highlighted the gap in readiness, in mobility, in commitment. While some nations hesitated, the U.S. rewrote the tempo of support. But the EHADs weren't just about leading allies. They were also about rattling adversaries. Russia's intelligence community monitors Western aid shipments like a hawk. They count crates, trace barcodes, map convoys, and when they realized the U.S. wasn't just sending tanks, but the tools to move them faster than Russia could stop them, that hit differently. It told Moscow one thing: the West isn't stepping back, it's evolving. It wasn't just about firepower anymore. It was about infrastructure, planning, tactical speed. And the U.S. was setting a standard others hadn't even prepared for. For Russian commanders, this was a logistical horror story. Every Abrams delivery now came with a silent threat. It could be anywhere, anytime, and we might not know until it's too late. And then came the media silence. Russia couldn't spin this in their favor. They couldn't accuse NATO of direct aggression because these weren't combat troops. They weren't airstrikes. They were support systems, the kind that don't make headlines, but win wars. That subtlety made them more dangerous. Even inside the U.S., critics of Ukraine aid were suddenly confronted with a new reality. This wasn't throwing money at a problem. This was precision assistance, a logistical doctrine that empowered Ukraine without forcing America into a larger war. And for NATO leaders who'd grown complacent, it sent a subtle but sharp reminder: modern warfare isn't just about weapons. It's about who can move them faster, smarter, and farther. EHADs didn't just arrive in Ukraine. They arrived in every strategic conversation happening across the alliance. And in each of those rooms, one truth echoed loudest: America isn't fading, it's leading. With all the strategy, symbolism, and raw momentum packed into the EHADS operation, one question still lingers. Can speed alone win a war? The answer isn't simple. Speed is powerful. Yes, it reshapes the battlefield, collapses enemy timelines, and rewires how decisions are made. But speed is a tool. What matters is how it's used and what it's paired with. Right now, Ukraine is pairing it with intent. Every EHADS convoy that rolls out carries more than tanks. It carries precision, surprise, and control. It transforms supply chains into shockwaves. Suddenly, Russian troops don't have days to prepare. They don't have time to shift reserves. By the time they realize where Ukraine is striking, it's already too late. That's psychological warfare. That's how you erode confidence, not just in trenches, but in war rooms. But the truth is, speed alone won't finish this war. It won't breach fortifications without backup. It won't hold territory without troops. It won't stop missile strikes. What it will do, though, is keep Ukraine in control of the rhythm. And in modern warfare, rhythm is everything. Think of it like a chess match, but with engines. The side that moves faster forces the other to react. When you're reacting, you're not planning. When you're not planning, you're bleeding. That's where Russia now finds itself. Reactive, scattered, defensive. And the battlefield is starting to reflect it. Analysts are already noting a shift. Ukrainian attacks are happening faster, deeper, and across multiple fronts. It's no longer one direction at a time. It's Zaporizhia in the morning, Kherson by nightfall. Armored columns appear, strike, vanish. For Russia, it feels like chasing ghosts with outdated maps. Meanwhile, Ukraine's logistics are no longer bottlenecked. They don't need weeks to build up for a push. They just move. When something goes wrong, it's rerouted. When a path is blocked, it's recalculated. There's no paralysis, no waiting. This independence has changed everything. Ukraine no longer asks for permission from NATO, from nature, or from chance. It dictates when to strike and how hard. That's why EHADS isn't just a machine. It's a test of whether smart logistics, battlefield flexibility, and raw speed can outmatch old world firepower. It's a challenge to Russia's doctrine, to NATO's traditions, and even to America's own military-industrial assumptions. Because if this works, if Ukraine can maintain pressure and push back with fewer troops, smarter movement, and faster deployment, it may mark a turning point in global warfare. The moment wars stopped being about who had more and started being about who moved better. That's the power of speed. Not as a tactic, as a mindset. And in this war, the side that masters time may just end up mastering victory. That's the full story behind Ukraine's silent weapon. Not a missile, not a tank, but speed itself, a strategy rolling across the battlefield disguised as logistics. And while the world watches headlines, what's really changing the war is what moves beneath them, quietly, quickly, and with purpose. If this deep dive helped you see the battlefield differently, hit that like button to push the algorithm in our favor. Subscribe for more stories that go beyond the noise and straight to the strategy. And if you believe in the kind of honest, fast, high-quality work we're doing here at Warfare Watch, consider clicking the thanks button below. It's your way of fueling this mission, so we can keep showing you what others miss. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What's your take? Can speed really shift the course of war? We'll see you in the next mission.